By 9:17 that night, the candles had burned so low that wax had started pooling around the holders. Marianne sat alone at the dining table, looking at the empty chair across from her. David's dinner had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. The wine remained unopened. Beside his plate was a small wrapped box she had hidden from him for weeks. It was their 26th wedding anniversary. Then her phone lit up. At first, she thought it might be David finally calling to apologize. It was not. It was a photograph. David was standing on the rooftop of a downtown hotel with Lauren Hayes tucked against his side. One arm was around her waist. His wedding ring was missing. He looked relaxed. Happy, even. Like the life he had shared with Marianne for more than 2 decades had become something he could step out of for the evening and forget. Under the picture, he had written, "A man should never need permission to choose happiness." Marianne read it twice, then a third time. She did not call him. She did not send an angry message. She did not drive across town and give them the scene they may have expected. She saved the post. Then she opened the joint bank account. The hotel charge was there. So was a payment connected to an apartment she had never heard of? Then came the preschool payments for a 5-year-old boy. By the time David walked through the front door, Marianne was no longer sitting there, waiting for an explanation. She was preserving evidence. If you believe betrayal usually leaves a trail, subscribe and stay with this story. Because David's public mistake was only the beginning, Marianne Cole was 52 years old, and she had always believed a stable life was built in small pieces. You paid the bills before they were due. You showed up when people needed you. You kept promises even when no one was watching. And when marriage became difficult, you did not throw it away just because the easy years were over. Marianne was not perfect. She worked longer hours than she should have. She worried about money even when their accounts were healthy. There were nights when she answered work emails at the dinner table, then apologized without really changing the habit. She could be overly cautious. Sometimes she planned for problems that never came. And for most of her life, she had put her family's needs ahead of her own so automatically that she barely noticed she was doing it. But Marianne was dependable. She remembered Emma's school deadlines. She knew when the car insurance renewed and where David had left the paperwork from their last mortgage refinance. She scheduled doctor visits, bought birthday cards, checked the smoke detectors, and made sure the house kept moving, even when everyone else was too busy to notice the work behind it. She and David had married when they were young and had very little. There was no expensive wedding, no perfect first home, no money waiting for them from wealthy parents. What they had was effort. They paid off student loans a little at a time. They spent years saving for a down payment. Their first house had old plumbing, drafty windows, and a kitchen floor that tilted near the refrigerator. They loved it anyway. When David's father became ill, Marianne handled the medications and appointment schedules. She drove him to specialists. She sat beside him during the long afternoons when David could not bring himself to watch his father grow weaker. She never held that against David. Grief made people fragile. Marianne understood that. They raised Emma together. They survived the year David lost his job and pretended not to be frightened. They made it through the winter. The furnace died 2 weeks before Christmas. They saved for college, contributed to retirement, and built routines that felt so solid. Marianne eventually stopped asking whether they could break. That was the danger of a long marriage. Sometimes the thing you trust most is not the person, it is the history. And David had once been a man who seemed careful with the people he loved. If he was running late, he called. He remembered birthdays without needing a reminder from his phone. He showed up for Emma's school plays, even when he had to sit in the back wearing his work clothes. On their anniversaries, he usually came home with flowers. They were not always the right kind. Sometimes they looked like they had been grabbed from a grocery store on the way home. But he brought them, and he always smiled when he handed them to her. Marianne had loved him for those small efforts. After 26 years, love was made from small efforts. Or at least, she had believed it was. Over the last few years, something between them had changed. It did not happen all at once. Their conversations became shorter. Dinner turned into a review of schedules, repairs, school events, and bills. Weekends disappeared into errands and unfinished work. There were nights when Marianne looked across the room and felt less like David's wife than the person assigned to manage the life they had built together. Still, she did not panic. People got tired. Careers became demanding. Teenagers needed more than their parents admitted. A marriage could go quiet, without being dead. Marianne told herself it was a season. 26 years did not disappear because two people had forgotten how to talk for a while. That was why the anniversary gift mattered so much. Several months earlier, Marianne had found David's father's old watch in a box at the back of their closet. The leather strap was cracked. The crystal was scratched. The hands had stopped at 4. 12 and had not moved in years. David had once told her it was the only thing of his father's he wished he had taken care of. So Marianne brought it to a repair shop. She had the mechanism restored. The crystal was replaced. The old leather strap was carefully matched instead of changed into something newer. Then she asked the jeweler to engrave a message inside the case. Still choosing you. 26 years. It was not an expensive gift. That was never the point. The watch carried David's father, their marriage, the years they had survived, and Marianne's quiet promise that she was still willing to work for the life they shared. What she did not know was that while she was restoring a piece of David's family history, David was spending their money on an anniversary evening with another woman. And he had been preparing for it longer than Marianne realized. For at least 6 months, David had been changing the story of their marriage, one sentence at a time. At first, the differences were easy to excuse. His business trips became more frequent, but the details became less clear. He talked about client dinners without mentioning who the clients were. He stopped leaving printed itineraries on the kitchen counter the way he had for years. His phone was almost always face down. When Marianne noticed he had changed the password, David said it was required by his company's new security policy. When he came home late, he went straight to the shower. He started buying new shirts for ordinary work days, then acted surprised when Marianne noticed. He also found ways to stay out of family photographs. At Emma's birthday dinner, he volunteered to take every picture. At school events, he stood behind the camera. When he went to the gym, he removed his wedding ring and sometimes came home without putting it back on. Every detail had an explanation. That was how deception survived for so long. Not because the story was good, because each excuse was just reasonable enough to delay the truth. Then the money began to change. Their monthly budget started coming up short, even though the mortgage, utilities, and grocery bills were mostly the same. One credit card payment was several $100s higher than Marianne expected. Then an unfamiliar transfer appeared between the ordinary household expenses. When she asked David about it, he did not explain. He attacked the question. Not every expense needs an interrogation. Another night, he told her, you turn everything into a problem. When Marianne asked why he had missed dinner 3 times in 1 week, David looked at her with a kind of quiet contempt she had never seen from him before. Maybe I stay late because coming home feels like another audit. That sentence stayed with her. Not because it answered anything, because it made her feel guilty for asking. Before long, Marianne was apologizing for questions that deserved honest answers. David began talking about happiness, as if marriage had stolen his. He said adults had a right to live for themselves. He complained that people should not need permission to see friends or enjoy their own lives. Around that same time, Lauren Hayes began appearing at the edges of his online world. She commented beneath his work posts. She uploaded photographs from cities David had supposedly visited alone. In one picture, she wore a gold bracelet Marianne remembered seeing on their credit card statement. Lauren also posted vague messages about a man who was finally brave enough to choose himself. David did not simply hide the connection. He tested Marianne with it. He would leave his phone where she could see Lauren's name appear, then turn the screen over before the message could be read. He mentioned Lauren casually doing dinner, as if she were nothing more than a coworker, then watched Marianne's face for a reaction. When Marianne finally admitted the pattern made her uncomfortable, David smiled without warmth. He called it middle-aged insecurity. That was the real warning. A locked phone could mean many things. A late night at work could be innocent. Even a strange charge might have an explanation. But when a reasonable question is turned into proof that you are jealous, unstable, or controlling, someone may be preparing their defense before you even know the crime. For months, David had been teaching Marianne not to trust her own judgment. On their anniversary, he finally gave her something no excuse could explain away. On the morning of their 26th anniversary, David said nothing. There were no flowers on the counter, no card beside her coffee, not even the distracted smile of a man pretending he had remembered at the last second. Marianne waited through most of breakfast. David drank his coffee with one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other. Emma had already left the room to finish getting ready for school. Finally, Marianne asked, "Are we still meeting at a restaurant tonight?" David looked up as though she had interrupted an important thought. "What restaurant?" She watched his face carefully. "The one I booked for our anniversary." For half a second, he looked genuinely confused. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I thought that was next weekend." Marianne almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 26 years, she could not believe he expected that answer to sound believable. She reminded him that they had discussed the reservation more than once. She had even sent him the time earlier that week. David glanced back at his phone. A client scheduled dinner tonight. "I can't cancel now. It would make me look unreliable." Marianne said nothing for a moment. Then she asked whether the client dinner could be moved. David sighed. It was the kind of sigh that made a simple question feel like a burden. "Marianne, it is one dinner. One dinner." As though she were upset about a restaurant instead of what the night was supposed to mean. As though 26 years could be moved to another weekend without so much as an apology. She watched him stand, straighten his jacket, and leave the kitchen. Before walking out, he kissed Emma on the forehead. He did not kiss Marianne. All day, part of her kept hoping there was another explanation. Maybe David had planned something awkward and secretive. Maybe he was pretending to forget because he wanted to surprise her later. It felt foolish. But hope often survives longer than dignity when a marriage has lasted that long. That evening, Marianne got dressed anyway. She wore the dark blue dress David had once told her made her look younger. She placed the restored watch in her handbag and drove to the restaurant alone. When the host asked whether her husband would be joining her, Marianne said he was running late. She believed it when she said it, or at least she wanted to. The table was set near the window. A small candle burned between two place settings. The chair across from her remained empty. Marianne ordered water and waited. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. The server came back twice and asked whether she wanted to order. Marianne kept saying she would wait a few more minutes. The candle grew shorter. The restaurant became louder as more tables filled. Glasses touched. Couples leaned toward each other. Somewhere behind her, a man laughed and wished his wife a happy anniversary. Marianne kept looking toward the entrance. At 9:17, her phone lit up. For one brief moment, relief moved through her. She thought David was finally calling. Instead, she saw his name above a new social media post. Marianne opened it. And there he was. David stood on the rooftop of a downtown hotel, with Lauren pressed close against his side. One arm rested around her waist. His head leaned toward hers. His wedding ring was gone. Lauren was wearing the gold bracelet Marianne remembered from the credit card statement. Between them sat a bottle of champagne, 2 glasses, and a dessert plate decorated with the words, "To New Beginnings." David was smiling. Not the tired smile Marianne had seen at home for the last several years. This smile was easy, proud. He looked like a man who wanted the world to know exactly where he was and who he had chosen to be with. The caption beneath the photograph read, "A man should never need permission to choose happiness." Marianne read the sentence again, then again. For several seconds, the noise of the restaurant seemed to disappear. She could still see people moving around her. She could see the server speaking to another table. She could see headlights sliding past the window. But none of it felt close. All she could see was David's arm around another woman. The missing ring. The bracelet. The words beneath the picture. He had not simply forgotten their anniversary. He had chosen that night to announce the affair. Publicly. 5 minutes later, another post appeared. This time, it was a short video. David and Lauren raised their champagne glasses and touched them together. Lauren smiled into the camera and wrote that confident women did not waste their lives holding on to men who had already chosen to leave. David responded with a heart. That was the moment Marianne understood this was not a careless mistake. They were not hiding anymore. They were performing.
They wanted people to see them.
More than that, they wanted Marianne to see them. Maybe they expected her to call. Maybe Lauren wanted a public argument she could use as proof that Marianne was unstable. Maybe David wanted one more excuse to tell people his marriage had become impossible. Whatever they were hoping for, Marianne did not give it to them. She did not call. She did not comment. She did not drive to the hotel. She did not throw the phone across the table or create a scene in the restaurant. Instead, she began saving everything. The photograph, the caption, the timestamp, the comments, the hotel location, the bracelet on Lauren's wrist, the video of the champagne glasses, David's heart beneath Lauren's post. Marianne saved each item twice, once on her phone, and once in an email account David could not access. Then she asked for the check. The server looked at the untouched place setting across from her and quietly removed it without asking questions. Marianne paid for the dinner she never ordered. Then she picked up the small box containing the restored watch and carried it back to the car. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. There were tears in her eyes by then, not the loud kind, just enough to blur the parking lot lights. She allowed herself that much. Then she wiped her face and drove home. The house was dark when she arrived. Emma was staying with a friend after a school activity, which meant Marianne had several hours alone before David returned. She placed the watch box on the kitchen table. For 26 years. That table had held permission slips, birthday cakes, unpaid bills, school projects, and late-night cups of coffee. That night, it became the place where Marianne stopped being only a wife and started becoming a witness. She opened the joint bank account. The hotel charge appeared almost immediately. It had been made earlier that afternoon. Then she found the bracelet. The amount matched the purchase she had questioned several weeks before. David had told her it was a client gift. That explanation had cost Marianne an apology. Now she knew who the gift was really for. She kept searching. Beneath the normal expenses, she found a recurring transfer to a property management company she did not recognize. The amount was $2,350. It had been leaving the account every month. Not for a few weeks. Not for several months. For nearly 4 years. Marianne stared at the payment history. The same amount. The same company. Month after month. David had not stumbled into an affair. He had built a second life and included it in the household budget. Carefully. Quietly. Hidden between the mortgage, insurance, groceries, and utilities, she searched the company name and found an apartment complex across town. The building was less than 20 minutes from David's office. The listing photographs showed modern kitchens, rooftop parking, and furnished units advertised to business professionals. Marianne sat back in her chair. The Betrayal had just become older, larger, and far more expensive. She wanted to keep searching, but another part of her wanted to close the computer and pretend she had misunderstood. That part of her was still married to the man David used to be. The rest of her understood that man might not exist anymore. Marianne looked at the watch box. Inside it was a message promising that she was still choosing him. Across town, David was celebrating a new beginning with another woman in an apartment his wife had helped pay for. She did not open the box again. When David came home, it was after midnight. Marianne heard his key in the lock. She heard him enter the house, carefully, trying not to make noise. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her sitting there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. David glanced at the closed laptop, then at the watch box on the table. "You're still up." Marianne looked at him. He smelled faintly of alcohol and a cologne she did not recognize. His wedding ring was back on his finger. That detail almost made her smile. He had remembered to put it on before coming home. David asked whether Emma was upstairs. Marianne told him she was staying with a friend. He nodded. Then he opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and acted as though he had returned from an ordinary client dinner. He did not mention the anniversary. He did not mention the photograph. He did not ask whether Marianne had gone to the restaurant. For a moment, she wondered how far he would take the lie if she gave him room. Then David looked at the unopened watch box. "What's that?" Marianne placed one hand over it. "Nothing you need tonight." He studied her face. There was a flicker of concern in his expression, but it disappeared quickly. David had spent months convincing himself Marianne would remain predictable. She would question him. He would become defensive. She would apologize. Then the subject would disappear. Her silence disturbed that pattern, but he was too confident to understand why. David went upstairs. Marianne remained at the kitchen table. She listened to the shower turn on. That was when she made her first real decision. She would not confront him. Not yet. She did not need another lie. She needed to know how much of her life had been used to finance his. The next morning, Marianne took Emma to school as usual. She packed her lunch, reminded her about a science assignment, asked what time soccer practice ended. Emma complained about an upcoming test and never noticed that her mother had slept less than 2 hours. Marianne was grateful for that. This was not Emma's burden. Not until Marianne understood what came next. After dropping her off, Marianne drove across town to a small office above a neighborhood pharmacy. The sign on the glass door read, "Elaine Porter, Family Law." Elaine was 61 years old. She wore simple glasses and spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen frightened people damage good cases by acting too quickly. Marianne sat across from her and placed the screenshots and bank statements on the desk. Elaine reviewed the photograph first, then the hotel charge, then the recurring apartment payment. She did not look surprised. That frightened Marianne more than sympathy would have. After several minutes, Elaine closed the folder. "From this point forward, you do nothing that can be used against you." Marianne listened. Elaine told her not to touch David's private phone, not to guess his passwords, not to install a tracker on his car or download software onto his devices. She told Marianne not to empty the joint account, even if she feared David might take the money first. She told her not to post accusations online, not to contact Lauren, and not to confront David until they had protected Emma and preserved the financial records. Pain made people want immediate answers. Elaine wanted evidence that would still matter months later, after anger had faded and lawyers had started asking questions. Marianne asked what she could legally collect. Elaine gave her a clear answer. Anything Marianne had a lawful right to access. Joint bank statements, family credit card records, tax returns stored in their shared files, financial emails sent to the household account, David's public posts, Emma's school and medical records, Calendars. Messages about pickups, appointments, and activities. Nothing stolen. Nothing hacked. Nothing that required Marianne to become the kind of person David could accuse her of being. According to Elaine, in their state, the way David had used marital money and reported his income could affect property division and child support. The affair mattered emotionally. The money would matter legally. And once Marianne began following the money, the story changed again. The first number Elaine circled was $2,350, the monthly apartment payment. It had left the joint account for nearly 4 years. Then came tuition payments to Cedar Grove Preschool. Marianne did not recognize the school. She searched the name and found a private preschool on the other side of town. The payments had been made regularly. Next were health insurance charges, linked to a child named Nolan Hayes.
Marianne stared at the name. Hayes. Lauren's last name.
At first, she assumed Nolan was Lauren's child from a previous relationship. That possibility was painful enough. It meant David had been using marital money to support his girlfriend's son while telling Marianne they needed to reduce contributions to Emma's college fund. But there was more. Transfers had also been sent to a company called Cedar Bridge Advisory LLC. David had listed it in their tax records as an outside consulting firm. Elaine studied the amounts. They were too regular to be ordinary business payments. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. David's bonuses had not disappeared. They had been redirected. Some of the money paid the apartment. Some covered school tuition and insurance. Some went into an education savings account with David listed as the adult custodian. Marianne felt something inside her go still. The same man who had told her they could not afford to add more to Emma's college account had been quietly saving for another child. Elaine compared dates. Nolan's birthday fell less than 9 months after David's first unexplained stretch of business trips. Marianne read the date once. Then she counted backward herself. There was no kindness hiding in the math. She stared at the documents as though the numbers might change if she waited long enough. They did not. The affair was no longer the only threat to her marriage. There was an apartment, a hidden stream of income, a child, and possibly 5 years of lies built around all three. The financial records were only one part of the danger Marianne now had to face. Before she had even filed anything, David had started talking to relatives about custody. He told them that if Marianne tried to leave him, he would demand equal time with Emma. He said fathers had the same rights as mothers. And he was right about that. But equal rights were not the same thing as equal responsibility. David had never handled half of Emma's daily life. He was not the one who remembered when her school forms were due. He did not schedule her medical appointments or keep track of soccer practices. He rarely knew which teacher needed an email or when Emma had to stay late for a project. He loved being introduced as a devoted father. He just had not done much of the work that devotion required. Elaine believed David's sudden interest in 50-50 custody had less to do with Emma than it did with money. Someone had apparently told him that equal parenting time could reduce child support. That made Marianne angry in a way the affair almost had not. Emma was not an account to balance. She was not a number David could move around to improve his financial position. Still, Elaine warned Marianne not to react emotionally. She was not to question Emma about her father. She was not to make the girl choose sides. She was not to use a frightened teenager as a witness in an adult betrayal. This is not about proving that he is a bad father, Elaine told her. It is about showing the court the life Emma is already living. So Marianne began documenting that life. She gathered the school pickup schedules. She saved emails with teachers and coaches. She organized dental appointments, doctor visits, parent conferences, and soccer practices. She kept the messages where David canceled at the last minute because something had come up at work. Then she compared those dates with Lauren's public posts. Several of David's business trips matched photographs Lauren had taken from the same hotels, restaurants, and cities. There was no dramatic confession. No single message that explained everything. Just a pattern. and patterns were harder to dismiss than excuses. For years, Marianne had been the parent who stayed awake when Emma was sick. She signed the forms. She waited in clinics. She rearranged meetings when school closed early. She remembered which medication caused a rash and which teacher had concerns about Emma's grades. David came to the important events when he could. Marianne built the ordinary days around them. The records made that difference clear. They also showed something else. David had spent years describing Marianne as controlling because she kept track of the family. Now the same records he mocked were protecting her. Then the case moved in a direction even Elaine had not expected. A notice arrived during the financial discovery process. It came from an attorney representing Lauren in a separate paternity matter. Elaine read the first page carefully. Then she read it again. David had begun denying that Nolan was his child. The denial had apparently started after Marianne discovered the apartment payments and the financial pressure around David increased. For years, he had paid Nolan's tuition, insurance, and living expenses. But once those payments threatened to become part of a legal record, David tried to step away from the child completely. Lauren was asking the court to establish paternity. A DNA test had been ordered. Elaine placed the notice in front of Marianne. For a moment, Marianne could not bring herself to touch it. There was no result yet. Only a date, a case number, and confirmation that the question had moved beyond suspicion. It now existed in a court file. Marianne read Nolan's name again. 5 years old. Old enough to ask questions. Old enough to recognize David. Old enough to believe whatever story the adults around him had been telling. Marianne felt betrayed by David. But she did not blame the child. Nolan had not opened the secret account. He had not rented the apartment or redirected the bonuses. He had not lied to Emma or stood on a hotel rooftop celebrating another woman's pain. The adults had created the damage. The children would be forced to live around it. That understanding kept Marianne focused. For the next several weeks, she behaved as though very little had changed. Every morning, she got up at the same time. She made breakfast. She reminded Emma about homework and drove her to school. Then she went to work and answered emails as if her marriage were not being taken apart in a lawyer's office across town. At home, she remained polite. If David asked a question, she answered it. If he mentioned a problem with the house, she discussed it. She did not ask where he had been on the anniversary. She never mentioned the hotel rooftop. She did not say Lauren's name. She did not tell him she knew about the apartment, the preschool tuition, the insurance payments, Cedar Bridge advisory, or Nolan. And she certainly did not tell him about Elaine. That silence was harder than anger would have been. There were nights when Marianne wanted to place every statement on the table and demand that David explain each charge. She wanted to ask how long he had been looking her in the eye while financing another home. She wanted to know whether he had ever felt guilty when Emma's college contributions were reduced. She wanted to ask whether he had thought about his father's watch while celebrating new beginnings with Lauren. But Marianne already understood something important. An explanation from David would not be the truth. It would only be the next version of the story. So she waited. David mistook that patience for surrender. He continued posting vague messages about freedom, courage, and finally choosing a better life. He wrote as though he were escaping a cruel marriage, instead of abandoning a wife who had spent decades holding that marriage together. Lauren continued responding. For a while, they both seemed convinced that the public had accepted the story they wanted to tell. David became almost careless. He came home later. He stopped explaining small absences. He spoke to Marianne with the confidence of a man who believed she was too frightened to leave. What he did not know was that Elaine had already started formal financial disclosure. Preservation requests had been sent. Records connected to the apartment, the LLC, and the savings account could no longer quietly disappear without raising more questions. The life David had hidden was being reduced to dates, transfers, signatures, and balances. He still believed the most dangerous thing Marianne had was a photograph from a hotel rooftop. He thought the public embarrassment was the real threat. It was not. The photograph had only opened the door. The money had led Marianne to the apartment. The apartment had led her to the preschool. The preschool had led her to Nolan, and the DNA test had answered the question David was still trying to deny. By the time the legal process reached its end, David had lost control of the story. He had tried to describe the marriage as already dead. The records showed he had still been using marital money while building a second home. He had tried to describe Marianne as unstable. Her calm decisions and careful documentation told a different story. He had tried to present himself as an equal parent. The school calendars, medical records, and years of cancelled pickups showed who had actually carried Emma's daily life. The affair had hurt Marianne. The evidence protected her. And patience gave the truth enough time to become impossible to explain away. Months later, Marianne stood outside Emma's school and faced David one final time. He had approached her after an event, when most of the parents were already leaving. For years, Marianne had imagined her future with a man standing in front of her. She had defended him when he was unemployed. She had cared for his father. She had waited through late nights and difficult seasons because she believed every marriage eventually passed through years that felt colder than the others. But some seasons did not pass. They revealed what had been growing underneath them. David tried to apologize. The words came quietly now. There was no speech about freedom. No complaint about being controlled. No claim that Marianne had driven him away. The confidence from the hotel photograph was gone. He said he had made mistakes. He said things had gone further than he intended. He asked whether there was any possibility they could repair what remained. Marianne listened. Once, those words would have been enough to make her question herself. Once, she might have mistaken regret for change. But David had not lost Marianne because of one photograph. He had not lost her because of one affair or one courtroom hearing. He had lost her through every lie he expected her to accept, every reasonable question he turned against her, every family sacrifice he treated as something she would continue making forever. Every dollar he moved while telling her they needed to be more careful. Every night, he allowed her to doubt her own judgment so he could protect the life he had hidden. Marianne did not need to remind him of all of it. The records had already done that. She simply looked at him for a moment, then turned away. Emma was waiting near the school entrance. Marianne walked toward her daughter, and together they disappeared into the crowd. David remained behind with an apology he had offered too late. The life Marianne returned to was smaller than the one she had expected. The large family home was gone. There were custody exchanges to manage, bills in her own name, and mornings when the silence felt unfamiliar. Some memories still arrived without warning. A certain restaurant, a bottle of champagne in a store window, a man turning his wedding ring around his finger. Healing did not erase those things. But Marianne's new life belonged to her. There were no secret apartments hidden inside the household budget. No payments she had to be ashamed for questioning. No empty chair across from her while another woman celebrated the future David had taken from their marriage. There was peace. Not the dramatic kind people post about. Just the quiet relief of knowing that no one in her home was asking her to ignore what she could plainly see. Marianne eventually understood that healing was not forgetting the betrayal. It was reaching the point where remembering it no longer changed the direction of her day. David had once believed her silence meant she would stay. He thought that because she did not scream, she would forgive. Because she did not confront him immediately, she had no courage. Because she moved carefully, she was weak. He had been wrong about all of it. Her silence was where she stopped reacting to his lies. It was where she began listening to herself again. It gave her time to turn suspicion into evidence, evidence into strategy, and strategy into a life that no longer depended on David telling the truth. That was the consequence he never saw coming. Not simply the money, not the custody schedule, not the court records or the DNA result. The real consequence was that Marianne reached a place where his apology could no longer change her mind. His betrayal had ended the marriage. It had not ended her. If Marianne's story reminded you that betrayal can break a marriage without breaking the person who survives it, subscribe for more stories about divorce, custody battles, financial truth, and the quiet courage it takes to begin again. And tell us in the comments, when do you believe Marianne truly took her power back?